Hey there, my name is Soran, and I'm a Laura from IFMSA Kurdistan, which is an NMO from the Middle East. Today I'm going to talk about the roots of homophobia, so I hope you find the video useful.
So, as we said, the topic we're talking about is the roots of homophobia. So, let's start. We're going to start with the definition of homophobia as how is someone a homophobe? People can be homophobic in many different ways. Homophobia takes the form of insults, discrimination, and even includes violence. Such abuse is motivated purely on the fact someone is of a different sexual orientation. This bullying is born out of ignorance, fear, and in many cases, immaturity. Homophobia isn't always obvious either. If you are ignored or not treated with the same respect as a heterosexual person, this is still homophobia. So, what are the results of these? If someone is covert or overt, meaning that if they're like if they are or not openly acknowledged about their homosexuality, homophobic violence causes enormous suffering, which is often shrouded in a veil of silence and endured in isolation. And this is what makes the problem more sensitive. So let's come to the terminology part. The root phobia from the Greek phobos, meaning fear, is used in clinical psychology to describe a type of an anxiety disorder that involves an irrational need to avoid situations. For example, there are people that are scared of confined spaces, which is called claustrophobia. This irrational need to avoid was coined by George Weinberg in the late 1960s by drawing from his personal interactions with colleagues and uh, that fit the clinical definition for phobia, uh, meaning that they were avoidant of people who were gay or who they suspected to be gay out of an anxiety and fear. Since then, homophobia has been adopted by politicians and social commentators on both sides of the aisle as a catch-all term for something highly specific and like unusual. The terminological limitations of homophobia extend to its unfinished background. Weinberg never got it to be recognized as a bona fide clinical condition. Instead, it remains as a clinical descriptor to test an anxiety. Helpful, but it is helpful, but not specifically treatable. But it is very important to know that he said like something. Yeah, it's here. He says that homophobia is an illness. No doubt about that. What worse illness can there be than acute conventionality? You should pray every night that you don't wake up with it. And there's another part of the terminology. We're talking about homomisia now. One of the many alternatives to homophobia that have cropped up in recent years is homomisia. It's coined in 2003 by then editor-in-chief of Psychology Today, Robert Epstein. Homomisia replaces the suffix phobia with the Greek root misos, which designates hatred or aversion, making homomisia the definitional hatred of homosexuals. Homomisia places the burden of hate on the hater. Conversely, homophobia implies that the subject of fear is somehow legitimately terrifying. Instead, when people talk of homophobia, they're in fact noting an attitude stemming from ignorance and bias, which homomisia covers. And Homomisia has not gained widespread usage because it has some problems on its own. It implies, along with homophobia, that its harbingers, meaning its indicators, are irrational and in need of rehabilitation. Um, Additionally, self-proclaimed homomystics have adopted the word to express their hatred of the wicked uh, as an act of righteousness. So, Karen Edwards, a research scientist and a writer, suggests the more comprehensive, less problematic, and thoroughly clunky words to be used, which are pro and anti-LGBTQ+, which is the least problematic. And this is a quote from Epstein, which says, quote, violence against gays is a hate crime. After all, it would be absurd to call it a fear crime. Suggesting that gays are in any sense objects of fear was ludicrous from the beginning, in my view. And now we're going to talk about homohysteric culture. So the power of homophobia is such that homosexual individuals often feel culturally compelled to mispresent their sexuality, which is something known as being quote unquote in the closet, in order to avoid social stigma. However, homophobia also impacts heterosexuals, as it is impossible to definitely prove one's heterosexuality. Heterosexuals and homosexuals wishing to be thought heterosexual are compelled to avoid associating with anything coded as homosexual. And this is accomplished through the repeated association with cultural codes of heterosexuality and dissociation from codes for homosexuality. Conversely, the suspicion that someone is homosexual often is cast upon whoever displays behavioral gender coded appropriate for the opposite sex. For men, competitive team sports, violence, cars, beer, and an emotionless disposition have been associated with masculinity and thus heterosexuality, while an appreciation of the arts, fine food, in individual sports, and emotional expressionism has been associated with homosexuality. This equation, of course, is reversed for women. So, in a homohysteric culture, which is a term coined by American sociologist Eric Anderson, individuals are concerned with proving their heterosexuality because homosexuality is stigmatized. Conversely, when cultural homophobia is so great that citizens do not generally believe that homosexuality is even possible. As in many contemporary Middle Eastern, African, and Asian cultures, there is no need to prove to, for example, your peers that one is not gay. A manifestation of this notion can be seen in Iran, whose president, whose name is Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, said in a speech in the United States in 2007 that his country had no homosexuals, which is literally impossible. Others have sometimes labeled homosexuality a quote unquote white disease. Ironically, in some highly homophobic yet not hysteric cultures, heterosexuals are given more freedom of gendered expression. Men can, for example, hold hands in many highly homophobic cultures, which is because others do not perceive they can be homosexual. While hand holding among men raises homosexual suspicion in the West. And now we're going to talk about the history. Um, it is largely believed that the sexual desire of one man for another was an acceptable, often venerated form of love in Asian cultures. Intolerance towards homosexual behavior grew particularly in the Middle Ages. especially among the adherents of Christianity and Islam. To understand the wider cultural impact of homophobia, awareness of the general societal consensus of the nature of homosexuality is necessary. What would that mean? So, in Western cultures, in the later 19th century, some psychologists began to view homosexuality as more than a temporary behavior, understanding that it was immutable. As industrialization brought migration from rural to urban areas, the greater density of people in cities permitted same sex attracted individuals to organize, which ultimately led to greater visibility and the scientific study of homosexuality. So, the term homosexuality was first used in 1868, and the research of Richard von Krafft-Ebing 2 decades later in a research called Psychopathia Sexualis in 1886 portrayed homosexuality as a fixed sexual desire. So, in 1905, Sigmund Freud popularized the erroneous notion that homosexuality was the product of a child's upbringing, and it is thought. It is thought that Freud even gave child rearing tips to help parents lead their children to heterosexual adjustment. And we have a saying from Freud, which is the presence of both parents plays an important part. The absence of a strong father in childhood not infrequently favors the occurrence of inversion, in which Freud here associates the absence of a strong father in childhood with someone being gay. So let's continue with our history part. With Freud's warnings in mind, and because of the long working hours that men spent under industrialization, homosocial organizations, for example, sporting clubs and Boy Scouts, were developed to introduce young boys to heterosexual masculine role models in the absence of their fathers. The teaching of masculinity to boys and femininity to girls was, and often remains, falsely believed to be able to prevent children from being homosexual. And this is related to Sigmund Freud's sayings. So, gender has long been implicated with sexuality, and the trials of Irish writer Oscar Wilde, who in 1895 was convicted of gross indecency, furthered this belief. The unusual aesthetic appearance of that Wilde represented, alongside his penchant for aesthetic art and beauty, helped formulate homosexual suspicion for men who shared Wilde's feminine hair, as you can see in the picture. Wilde's conviction thus helped promote the stereotype that homosexuality existed among feminine men, thereby erroneously disqualifying masculine acting men from homosexual suspicion. Western homophobia and homohysteria peaked in the 1980s with the spread of AIDS. The disease brought greater public awareness that homosexuals existed in every social institution, and the infectious nature of the disease further stigmatized homosexual men. It also ended, particularly in Western cultures, the presumption of heterosexuality. As Christian based fundamentalism grew stronger in the United States during this period, men there were particularly resolute to align their behaviors and identity with heterosexuality. The feminine expressions among men were thus edged towards extinction. Simultaneous with this, homophobia and homohysteria, um, however, there was also a growth of political advocacy for the rights of homosexuals and abatement of anti gay laws. By the beginning of the 21st century, AIDS was recognized as a problem of heterosexuals as much as homosexuals, and anti gay laws were stripped from most Western countries. This, combined with the increased visibility of gays and lesbians, decreasing homophobia from some branches of Christianity, the ability of heterosexuals to socialize with gay men and lesbians on the internet, and increasing percentage of homosexuals coming out, and of course the greater awareness that homosexuality is produced biologically, greatly reduced the cultural homophobia. In Europe and much of the North America, sexual minorities were awarded most of the rights of heterosexuals, including some, for example, marriage and or as some states call it, state-recognized civil partnerships. Research in the early 21st century found that in Western Europe and North America, young people began to rapidly dissociate themselves from homophobia, so weakening homohysteria that youths there were more capable of expressing a range of gendered behaviors, regardless of their sexuality, of course. And rapidly decreasing cultural homophobia increasingly meant that it was homophobia that was stigmatized rather than homosexuality. This decrease in cultural and legal homophobia has been uneven, however. While homosexuality was decriminalized throughout North America, South America, Europe, and Australia, the picture in Africa and parts of Asia is more divided. For example, though South Africa prohibited discrimination against homosexuals in its post-apartheid constitution adopted in the mid-1990s and legalized same-sex marriage in the first decade of the 21st century, homosexual behavior remained illegal in the countries that border it. In most of the Middle East, for example, the laws against gays and lesbians also remained severely restrictive. For example, in some countries where particularly conservative Islamic law was practiced, individuals who engage in homosexual behavior could be punished by death. And the last part of these slides is the theories about homophobia. So the first one is that it's frequently assumed that feelings of personal threat result in strong negative attitudes toward homosexuality, whereas lack of threat leads to neutral or positive attitudes. This perspective often is associated with the term homophobia, and it derives from a psychodynamic view that prejudiced attitudes serve to reduce tension aroused by unconscious conflicts. Such a strategy permits people to externalize the conflicts and to reject their own unacceptable urges by rejecting lesbians and gays who symbolize those urges without consciously recognizes the urges as their own. Since contact with homosexual persons threatens to make conscious those thoughts that have been repressed, it inevitably arouses anxiety in defensive individuals. Consequently, defensive attitudes are likely to be negative. And heterosexual men may envy gay men because the latter are not constrained by the masculine ideal. Heterosexuals may also envy the sexual freedom presumably enjoyed by lesbians and gay men. In either case, the envy is presumably translated unconsciously into hostility. Another scientist proposed that negative feelings towards opposite sex homosexuals result from heterosexuals feeling feelings of rejection as potential sexual partners. And Weinberg, this is another theory. Weinberg, which is the scientist that coined the word homophobia, hypothesized that since many people strive like for vicarious immortality by having children, and since lesbians and gays are perceived, of course incorrectly, as having rejected this means, and this is eluded with the thought of the finality of death, and the latter evoke an unconscious fear of death.
So we're going to conclude the video by some studies that have found that people with these negative attitudes are less likely to have had personal contact with any lesbians or gays, and are less likely to have reported being engaged in any homosexual activity, and are more likely to have been resided in somewhere that these negative attitudes are the norm, especially during adolescence, and are more likely to be older and less well educated, and are more likely to be religious and have been subscribed to a conservative religious ideology, and are more likely to express traditional restrictive attitudes about sex roles. So I hope you liked the video, and have a good day and stay safe.